delving more deeply into aspects of Jesus' character. Hi, I'm Mark Mellinger. Thank you for joining us. I'm reporting from the Gospel Coalition National Conference 2013, and joining me to help navigate this discussion is Alistair Begg. He is the senior pastor, of course, longtime senior pastor at Parkside Church in Cleveland. Alistair, really good to have you with me today.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
Well, you and your friend Sinclair Ferguson have just co-authored a new book on 7 key aspects of Jesus' identity. Let me ask, first of all, why this book at this time?
Well, it actually emerged as a result of Sinclair and I being invited to speak at a conference, first of all in Memphis a few years ago. And the subject matter of the conference was Jesus. And at that conference, we noted the fact that despite the fact that we're Christians and despite the fact that we say much about Jesus, there isn't really very much really written about Jesus. And so it occurred to us at the time, maybe we ought to take some of this material and do something with it. And so that was the genesis of it.
Was there one aspect of Jesus' personality as you were studying this that you found particularly poignant and into which you gained new insight?
Yes, I think probably the whole aspect of Jesus as the suffering servant, as the one who fulfills, the prophecies in Isaiah. To all of a sudden, press into that and realize that we're not talking here about a sort of theological formula, but we're talking about what is really a flesh and blood reality, and the dimensions of the suffering of Christ, which not only explains the nature of the atonement, but it also in some measure gives legitimacy to the followers of Jesus when they are suffering. And I think that was one of the things that struck me quite forcibly in that particular chapter.
Well, and there's a reason that's there, and the Bible tells us we're to look to Him. We're to look to Him when we're going through these times of suffering. I think what you find is if you do that, you can endure suffering more, because we're in a culture here in comfortable 21st century North America where we don't suffer well because we don't expect it. But isn't that the biblical expectation?
Well, it is. Even when Paul invites Timothy to join him in pastoral ministry, he says, join me in suffering for the gospel. I mean, he doesn't hold it out to him as a soft option. And I think also it speaks to the issue of the sort of triumphalism that is very often a part of our Christian testimony that doesn't really play well with people either, because the idea that Jesus puts a constant smile on our face, that He moves us to a realm that takes us beyond these realities, is neither true to the Bible nor is it true to human experience. And so to focus in that way and to work that out, I think is helpful on multiple levels.
That's been a key aspect of your ministry for a long time. You haven't been afraid to say that, to reset the expectations of the people in your church. And you've been at the church for a very long time. In
100 years.
Not quite that long, but 3 decades. That's a long time. 30 plus years is a long time, and that's your topic in the workshop that you're doing here at the Gospel Conference, the Gospel Coalition Conference. So I'm interested in talking to you about that briefly. What has been the greatest joy of staying in one place for so long, and what has been the hardest thing about being the pastor of Parkside for so long?
It's easier to do the first question than the second one. I have to think about the second one. Actually, last night I said to the folks as we finished our communion service that when I had to do the seminar later on this week, that one of the things that I would say at the seminar was that one of the greatest delights in being a pastor over the long haul in a place is expressed in that gathering that was there last night. I mean, we welcomed people into membership, and one of the young men that I welcomed into membership, he wasn't even born, when I started there. He graduated, he went on to law school, he decided to move back to Cleveland in order that he could come back to the church, in order that he could serve in the church. I'm marrying now the children of the people that I married at the beginning. It's really what John says, the tremendous delight that is there in seeing your children walking in the truth. Just as you see your own physical children grow, just to see spiritual children, making headway. In terms of the hardest thing, I don't know what I would say is actually a hard thing. I think the biggest problem I've had in 30 years at Parkside Church is me. You know, that if that I am my own biggest problem. That
In what sense?
well,
in what
this-
regard?
Well, in every sense. That, you know, the Westminster Confession says that the Christian is involved in a continual and irreconcilable war.
Amen.
On three fronts: against the world, the flesh, and the devil. And you know, the biggest challenges we have are dealing with our own pride, with our own attitude towards others, making sure that we don't think that just because we've preached it, we have actually lived it. That's a real snare. That's why James, you know, says what he says. That, you know, not too many of you should become teachers, because the danger of that is a real danger. And maybe that would be it.
Is it still difficult for you after all these years of ministry to meditate deeply on Jesus and to find him interesting? Do you still have times when Christianity feels dull? And if so, how do you fight through that?
Well, you know, dullness, I think, is more the attitude of our hearts. You know, there's certainly nothing dull about the story.
Of course.
So, and familiarity with it ought to just increase our sense of joy and affection for it. But yeah, there are seasons in our souls. I mean, there are times when...
Dry is probably a better word, a dry season.
Winter time, rather
Right.
than springtime, when you don't see the evidence of the work that's going on underneath, because you don't see the plants rising for the springtime. But God teaches us things in that as well, you know, and I've found, I would have to say, that I have learned more in terms of Christian pilgrimage in times of disappointment and in failure than I have learned actually in times of success and laughter. And I think that there's a principle in that as well. It takes us back into the question of suffering again.
I know you love your people, so please understand that. That's the caveat to this question. But, you know, I've worked at the same place for 15 years. You've worked at the same place for much longer than that, for double that time. And there are days when I think, this place is old. I mean, there's more out there. Do I really have to spend the rest of my life here with the same walls, same people, same stuff? There have got to be times when Parkside, as much as you love it and you love your people, feels like that. It feels a little stale. There are probably a lot of pastors in that situation. What counsel do you have for them when those sinful thoughts, I guess they're sinful thoughts, occur to you?
Well, you know, I'm going to write a book one day that is called No Dull Days.
Yeah.
And the thesis of it will be that in the course of pastoral ministry, you have disappointing days, you have delightful days, you have disastrous days. But I don't have dull days.
You never have a dull day.
I don't have dull days. No, I do not. I'm energized at every point along the way, increasingly by the young men who are my colleagues in ministry, and we're going further and further down the food chain, as it were, or up the food chain, in bringing alongside us as we age the vibrancy of youth and the expectation that is there, and in catching something of that anticipation in their eyes and in their hearts takes me back to when I was their age. And I honestly say, you know, if I get the opportunity to speak to seminary students, I always am able to say to them with conviction, if it were possible for me to turn back time and to begin all over again, to sit where you sit, I would sign up for it in a minute. That's how energized I continue to be by the privileges and opportunities. That's not to say there aren't dull days or disastrous days or difficult days. I'm not being Pollyanna about it. I usually when I finish on a Sunday, I tell my wife I'm going to get a job in the post office. But that's because I thought that I preached so poorly again. You know, how many bad Sundays can you have before they throw you out or before you jump? So maybe that is a better answer.
How do you, couple last things, how do you fight to stay humble with the advent of Truth for Life? I mean, you have been on the radio now for the better part of 2 decades, talking to hundreds of thousands of people every single day. How do you, and I know you well enough, I don't know you well enough, but I feel like I know you well enough to know that you're aware of that and you don't want that to get, to really form roots in your soul. Tell me how you fight to stay humble.
Well, first of all, the great thing about radio is you never know if anyone's listening to the radio, right. Unless someone comes to tell you. And every so often I go somewhere and say, I listen to you every day on the radio. I say, oh, you're the person. And so really via radio, you speak to one person at a time in some ways. You know, the answer to that is that I've never been really enamored with it. The genesis of it was outside of me. The person who runs it was the driving force behind it. He remains the genius in the operation of it. I in many ways feel myself to be the beneficiary of what other people have chosen to do. And since I seldom, if ever, listen to myself, maybe I should listen to myself. That would be the key to humility. You know, the key to humility, I think, is a good wife. A good wife. And children who love you with a passion, but they're not enamored of you.
They're honest,
you know,
children.
They're just dead honest, yeah.
Yes.
And I have those kids.
Yeah, well, so do I. That's a blessing. How much longer do you think you'll pastor?
Well, I'll be 61 in May, and I feel fairly healthy. You know, if God's good to me, maybe I can do another 10 years.
Alistair Begg, thank you, brother.
Thank you very much.